They told him to leave the ceremony. His medal looked fake. But then, one woman stepped forward. What she held in her hands changed everything. Why did a child's gift matter more than a soldier's honor? The answer left a whole town speechless. Stay to the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The weather in Belden Ridge was unusually warm for November. The sky stretched overhead in a soft blue haze, and a light breeze sent amber and crimson leaves swirling lazily along the streets. Families lined the sidewalks with foldable chairs and small flags, waiting for the start of the annual Veterans Day parade. Children clutched paper signs, and old brass band instruments glinted in the sunlight. The air smelled of dry leaves and faint cinnamon from the nearby bake sale. Near the heart of the park, by the stone monument honoring local service members, veterans slowly gathered in their uniforms. Some wore full dress, others simple caps or faded jackets with patches. Among them stood a man noticeably older than most. His frame was slightly hunched, his boots worn, his jacket frayed at the cuffs. The fabric had dulled to a washed-out green, and the insignias had faded into barely legible shapes. But what stood out most was the object pinned squarely to his chest, a bright, overly polished metal that sparkled with unnatural shine under the sun. It was shaped like a star but lacked the weight or gravitas of military honor. Its edges were uneven, its surface free of the usual etchings or numbers. The ribbon attached was made of thin synthetic thread, more decorative than ceremonial. To the trained eye, it looked like something sold at a dollar store or handed out at a children's summer camp. As the man adjusted his collar and took a seat on the park bench, he caught glances from others around him. Young volunteers setting up chairs and adjusting the microphone cables paused and whispered to each other. A few chuckled quietly, one pulling out his phone to snap a discreet photo. The screen captured the gleaming metal and the solemn expression of the man beneath it. The whispering grew bolder as more people noticed. A few eyebrows raised. Someone murmured the word fake. Eventually, one of the event coordinators, a man in his 30s with a clipboard and pressed shirt, walked over with an air of polite firmness. He bent slightly, spoke quietly, and gestured toward the street. There were no harsh words, but the implication was clear. The man's presence, with that metal, was inappropriate. The coordinator referenced the importance of maintaining respect for authentic honors. The elderly man didn't protest. He looked at the ground for a moment, then slowly began to rise from the bench, brushing the dust from his coat as he prepared to leave. Around him, the buzz of the crowd continued, oblivious to the small moment unfolding near the monument. As the man turned to leave, his steps were slow, deliberate. The sound of leaves crunching beneath his worn boots barely rose above the surrounding murmurs. He had said nothing, made no attempt to argue or plead his case. He simply accepted the gesture with the kind of quiet resignation that only comes from years of being misunderstood. His hand rested briefly on the back of the bench he had just left, as if to steady himself, then slipped back to his side as he took his first steps away from the crowd. He hadn't made it more than a few feet before a sharp voice cut through the noise, not loud but clear and steady. It came from a tall man in a full military dress uniform, ribbons and medals aligned in perfect order across his chest. His posture was straight, commanding, the kind that made people instinctively take notice. A few nearby veterans straightened their backs when they recognized him. Major Benjamin Ward, retired Army, and a respected figure in town. The major had been walking toward the podium when he noticed the quiet commotion, the movement, the looks, the body language of dismissal. It caught his attention. His pace slowed. He observed for only a few seconds before stepping directly between the elderly man and the event coordinator. Without hesitation, he raised a hand to halt the moment and asked for an explanation. The coordinator, caught slightly off guard, explained in careful words that the man's medal appeared to be counterfeit, and that several attendees had found it inappropriate. He spoke with a tone of professionalism, but there was an undercurrent of defensiveness, as if unsure whether he had overstepped. The major listened without interruption, his face unreadable, eyes fixed not on the coordinator, but on the older man. There was a brief pause after the explanation, one that seemed to stretch longer than it was. The surrounding conversations tapered off as more people sensed the tension. A few bystanders edged closer, curiosity drawing them toward the scene. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves. A veteran in a wheelchair turned his head toward the center of attention. The major didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue orders. But when he stepped forward and placed himself fully between the two men, the gesture alone sent a clear message. His presence created a stillness, a sudden quiet that made the shuffle of paper programs and the rustle of coats seem unnaturally loud. The old man, who had quietly given his name as Archie Sloane, remained silent. His eyes met no one's gaze directly, but they wandered briefly across the growing circle of faces. There was no anger in them, no offense, only the distant, weary look of someone who had carried a burden longer than anyone around him realized. No one spoke for a moment, and then the major took a single step to the side, not to escort Archie away, but to make room for him to stay. They had placed a folding chair beneath the oldest oak in the park, where the filtered sunlight created a patchwork of golden light and shadow on the grass. The murmurs of the crowd had softened, the focus drifting back to the stage preparations and flag displays. But a small pocket of attention remained fixed on the man sitting quietly in the shade. He rested his hands on his knees, his shoulders slightly slouched, the gleaming metal still visible against his worn jacket. Birds chirped in the branches overhead, and now and then a leaf drifted down, brushing his arm or the brim of his cap. Among the few who still lingered nearby was a young woman in a volunteer sash, no older than 30. Her name tag read Jenna, and she had spent most of the morning coordinating arrivals and organizing programs. Yet something about the man's stillness pulled her back. She hesitated at first, unsure whether to intrude, but eventually approached and crouched beside him. There were no cameras now, no whispers, just quiet curiosity. She asked her question gently, with no edge, no accusation. The kind of question that invited honesty. The man turned toward her, his movements slow, and looked into her eyes for a long moment before speaking. His voice was quiet, a little hoarse, as if unused to long sentences. He did not embellish or dramatize. He simply told the truth. He told her about a fire 4 decades earlier in a neighborhood on the south edge of town. A house had gone up in flames in the early hours of the morning. He had been a firefighter then, long before arthritis and age slowed his steps. That morning, he had carried a small girl out of thick black smoke and collapsing wood, her nightgown singed, her face streaked with soot. She had been clinging to a stuffed rabbit. A week later, she returned with her mother. The girl had something in her hands, a makeshift medal crafted from a circular piece of tin, painted gold with nail polish, hung from a loop of red yarn. It had words etched into it in clumsy, uneven letters, "To the best hero in the world." She placed it in his hand and said she didn't want him to forget her. He never did. He had kept that medal for years, through moves, through retirement, through losing friends and family, through days when no one called and holidays spent alone. The official awards and certificates had faded from his walls. But this small, imperfect gift remained, tucked in a box, then eventually pinned to his jacket. It wasn't military, it wasn't regulation, but it was his most valuable decoration. Jenna didn't respond right away. She stood silently, her hand briefly touching the corner of her badge, as if grounding herself. Then, without a word, she turned and walked quickly toward the back of the stage. She disappeared behind the temporary curtain, and for 10 minutes, she didn't return. The ceremony began as it always did in Belden Ridge. Chairs arranged in careful rows filled with families, veterans, students, and town officials. The monument at the center of the park stood tall, wreaths placed at its base, flanked by American flags catching the early November wind. The air was crisp but not cold, and the sun shone through the branches of the oak trees, casting shifting shadows across the grass. A local high school choir stood in their matching maroon jackets, nervously clutching their sheet music. Parents whispered quiet reminders to their children to sit still. The mayor, a woman in her early 50s with a calm presence and steady tone, stepped forward to the podium and began her speech. She welcomed the town and spoke about gratitude, sacrifice, and remembrance. Her words flowed as they had every year, familiar, polished, heartfelt. Behind her, rows of veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, some in full dress uniform, others in old jackets and caps that had seen better years. Among them, still seated beneath the large oak, was Archie Sloane. He hadn't moved much since he'd been asked to leave. He sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes not watching the stage, but somewhere in the distance, as if lost in memory. The medal still hung from his chest, catching small flickers of light every time a gust of wind stirred his coat. After the mayor concluded her remarks, the MC resumed the program. The names of fallen soldiers were read aloud, each name followed by the toll of a ceremonial bell. The sound rang across the park, solemn and steady. Some in the crowd bowed their heads, others wiped away tears. It was a tradition the town held sacred, a rhythm of grief and honor woven into every Veterans Day. The list moved on. Then, without warning, the voice at the microphone faltered. The MC paused mid-name, blinked, and turned slightly, as if receiving a quiet instruction. There was a short moment of confusion. Then he stepped back, and from behind the staging area, Jenna emerged. She was no longer wearing her volunteer sash. Her hands were empty now, and her face bore a seriousness that hadn't been there earlier in the day. She walked to the center of the stage, not hurried, but with intention. The audience noticed. Conversations halted. Even the breeze seemed to settle. Jenna stood before the microphone and adjusted it with one hand. There was no paper, no script. She looked out across the crowd, taking in the faces of people she had known her entire life. Neighbors, classmates, teachers, shop owners. Her eyes found the veterans, then the children, then her mother waiting near the back. She began to speak, and though her voice was soft at first, it carried. She told them that something had happened that morning, something small but revealing. She recounted, briefly and without blame, how an older man had been asked to leave. She acknowledged the whispers, the doubts, the photo that had been taken and passed between phones. She explained that the medal in question was not standard issue. It had no serial number, no accompanying citation. It wasn't issued by the military. It wasn't even made of proper metal. But then, her voice shifted. She told them that sometimes the truest things aren't polished or official. Sometimes the real weight of an object isn't in what it's made of, but in why it was given. She described a fire many years ago. A 6-year-old girl trapped in her bedroom as flames consumed the hallway. A firefighter breaking through a window, carrying her down a ladder, placing her safely in her mother's arms. A child who days later created a medal of her own, out of tin, yarn, and glue. A medal with uneven letters that read, "To the best hero in the world." A pause followed. A hush. No one moved. Then she said it. That little girl was her mother, and she was here today. The effect rippled instantly through the crowd. People began turning, scanning the rows. Some stood, others gasped quietly. Near the center aisle, a woman in a long blue coat stepped forward. Her hair was white and pulled back in a neat bun. She held a small worn box in both hands, weathered, taped at the corners, but still intact. She didn't walk quickly, but she didn't hesitate either. She moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had waited for this moment for far too long. The crowd parted naturally. No one needed to be told who she was. All eyes followed her as she made her way to the front, toward the stage where Archie still sat beneath the oak. His eyes slowly lifted. Their gazes met from across the clearing. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence spoke louder than words ever could. There were tears on her cheeks, but her expression held something steadier than emotion. Recognition, gratitude, connection across 4 decades. She stopped just a few steps from him, the small box clutched gently in her hands. Around them, the entire ceremony seemed to freeze in time. And in that stillness, the story of the medal, its meaning, its history, its truth, silenced every doubt that had come before it. Archie remained seated for a moment longer, his weathered hands resting lightly on his knees. He looked at the woman standing before him, her features aged but unmistakably familiar. There was no shock on his face, no dramatic reaction. Just a slow, dawning stillness that washed over him like the final piece of a puzzle falling quietly into place. The distant gaze he had carried all morning began to soften. Something shifted in his posture, as if an invisible weight had finally been acknowledged, shared, and halved. With deliberate care, he pushed himself up from the bench. His legs trembled slightly, more from age than emotion, but he stood tall. The wind caught the edge of his coat and fluttered the ribbon of the tin medal that still clung proudly to his chest. The woman took one small step forward, then looked down at the faded box in her hands. Slowly, she opened it. Inside lay a second medal, identical in size, shape, and childish imperfection. The same crude circle of tin, the same uneven strokes of paint, the same red string frayed at the edges. It was not a replica, it was a twin. The other half of something deeply personal, held apart for decades and now reunited in a moment that required no explanation. She had kept it all these years, through school, through motherhood, through life's long, unpredictable detours. A token made with glue and love, folded carefully into tissue and placed in a jewelry box, too important to throw away. She had searched for him in newspapers, in public records, in town directories, The trail had gone cold time and again. But he had been here all along, quietly, silently, with her gift pinned to his heart. Around them, the audience stood frozen. The moment felt suspended in something larger than itself. No one knew exactly what to do next, as if any sound might break whatever unspoken magic had descended on the park. Even the birds seemed to hold back their song. Then someone clapped. Just once at first, then another followed, and another. It started slowly, hesitant palms meeting in the air, then grew with force. Within seconds, the silence gave way to a rising wave of applause that spread like a tide through the crowd. But this wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't the obligatory acknowledgement that often followed ceremonial speeches. It was different, heavier, deeper. People weren't just applauding the moment. They were applauding the story, the decades it had taken to arrive here, the invisible thread of gratitude that had stretched across time and loss and landed with perfect symmetry on this stage. Veterans removed their hats and held them over their hearts. Soldiers in dress uniforms straightened into salute. Elderly men stood slowly, some with the help of canes, others placing hands on each other's shoulders for balance. Children who didn't fully understand the significance stopped fidgeting and watched, wide-eyed. Some of the younger volunteers, those who had laughed earlier, stood in the back, unmoving. Their expressions had shifted from amusement to reflection. The phone that had been used to record Archie earlier was quietly tucked into a pocket. The smirks were gone, replaced with silence. Jenna stood near the side of the stage, watching everything unfold. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She simply stood still, letting the moment live. Her mother remained where she was, the open box in her hands trembling slightly, her mouth closed in a line that held back years of emotion too complex to name. Archie remained standing, his chest rising and falling with each breath. But his shoulders no longer sagged. He looked not at the crowd, but at the small object in the woman's hands, at the mirror of the medal he wore. A part of him had always wondered if it had mattered, if she remembered, if it was just a child's gesture lost to time. Now he knew. And in that knowing, something long buried began to lift. A week after the ceremony, the atmosphere in Belden Ridge still carried the quiet hum of something unforgettable. Conversations at the diner lingered a little longer, and glances between neighbors held a shared understanding that hadn't been there before. The story had spread faster than anyone expected, not through headlines or viral videos, but by word of mouth, passed gently from one person to the next like something sacred. At a town council meeting held the following Monday, the first order of business was not a budget or road repair. It was Archie Sloan. The mayor proposed it herself, her voice steady, her eyes determined. She didn't need to explain why. The vote was unanimous, no debate, no hesitation. By the end of the week, a small team from the Public Works Department returned to the park. They worked quietly, early in the morning before the regular joggers arrived. Beneath the old oak tree, on the bench where Archie had sat that day, they installed a bronze plaque. It wasn't large or flashy, just a simple, rectangular plate fastened to the wood with care. The engraving was short, but the weight of its message was unmistakable. Some metals are heavier than bronze because their weight is in the deed. Visitors began to notice it within hours. Some sat beside it for a while. Others touched the edges of the metal before moving on. A few left small tokens, flags, folded notes, even handmade trinkets shaped like stars. Teachers brought students on field trips, using the story as a lesson in gratitude, humility, and quiet heroism. Archie, for his part, didn't seek attention. He continued his daily walks through town, stopping at the same corner store for his paper and coffee. He still visited the park, though he often chose a bench a little farther from the path. He no longer wore the medal on his coat, not because it meant less, but because it had already said everything it needed to say. Instead, he placed it in a glass display case at the town library. The librarian gave it a shelf near the entrance, beside a small collection of local history. Archie included a note in his own handwriting beneath the medal, written on simple lined paper and mounted behind the glass. It read, "Trust, recognition, and kindness outlast medal. This was given to me by someone who remembered. May we all remember what matters." People stopped to read it every day. Some left the library wiping their eyes. Others simply nodded and walked away quietly, but no one left unchanged. Then came the next Veterans Day. Early that morning, before the crowd had gathered at the park, a young girl, no older than 6 or 7, walked up to a man standing near the monument. He was a retired postal worker, wearing his old service jacket, sipping from a thermos. The girl held a piece of cardboard, carefully cut and painted, with a bit of yarn glued to the top. She looked up at him shyly and handed it over without a word. On it, written in blue crayon, were the words, "To my hero." By noon, it had happened again, with another girl and another veteran. By the end of the day, 5 handmade medals had been given out. None of them were official. None of them were made of metal, but they carried weight. It became a tradition, not organized, not scheduled, just something the town did, quietly and sincerely. And though Archie never said much about it, he was there every year, watching from the side, hands folded behind his back, eyes following the small acts that said more than speeches ever could. No one laughed anymore. Not at the medals, not at the stories, not at the quiet men who carried memories instead of titles, because Belden Ridge remembered now, and it would keep remembering.